Good evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones, here to answer your questions tonight. Liberal Party Vice President Teena McQueen, author, academic and self-identified bad feminist Roxane Gay, New South Wales Green Senator Mehreen Faruqi, the Shadow Minister for Environment, Water and Citizenship Tony Burke, and Research Director at the Centre for Independent Studies Simon Cowan. Please welcome our panel. Now, before we start, retiring government MP Craig Laundy was forced to withdraw late today because of a family emergency. We wish him and his family all the best. Thank you, Simon, for stepping in at the last minute. Now, Q&A is live in Eastern Australia on ABC TV, iView and News Radio. Well, tonight we're hoping to get to questions from across the nation via Skype, but our first question comes from right here in the studio. It's from Maya Abramovich.
Thank you, Tony. It appears that President Trump has dodged a bullet in respect of impeachment, given that the Mueller report has concluded that he's not guilty of any crime. What is your take on this, Roxane Gay, as a bad feminist? And will this give President Trump a free hand to do whatever he wants?
Well, I think Donald Trump already had a free hand, and that power protects power. So, you know, I think it's a little too soon to speculate about the Mueller report. People are talking about something that literally no one outside of a few people in the government have read. But is he going to get away with what he did? Absolutely. And it's incredibly disheartening. But I think right now what we need to do is focus on who can we support to unseat him in 2020. And that's where I'm choosing to put my energies.
Now, Roxane, Trump's been saying all along, he's been tweeting it on an almost daily basis, no collusion, no obstruction. Now Mueller has confirmed it. That much we do know about the report.
Well, he can barely spell collusion, so I'm not really... You know, he's been saying it all along because he knew, I think, that he was going to be exonerated or at least not be found guilty of collusion. I think a lot of people were engaging in profound wishful thinking that Russia was sophisticated enough to rig our election but not sophisticated enough to get caught. It doesn't make sense, and so I think he was very confident.
Teena McQueen.
Tony. Well, he's been exonerated. There's nothing there. I mean, it's 2 years of wasted of the presidency, 2 years of the Democrats going crazy, and, you know, he did nothing to interfere with the report. The report was done, they found nothing, end of story. They have to let up on him a bit now, or he'll be in 2020, another term.
So the questioner asked, will this give him a free hand to do whatever he wants? What do you think?
Well, he's never done whatever he wanted. He's always done what he thought was best for the nation. So I think he'll continue to do that. The economy's doing well, America's doing well. I mean, I don't see why people have any complaints against him.
Tony Burke.
Look, what Roxane said, I have to agree with the fact that we haven't seen this report. We don't know what's in it. Very few people have seen it. From Australia's perspective, our alliance and our relationship with America is something that goes beyond whoever's in office at any one point in time. America will deal with this in its own way, but certainly I think in Australia's way of relating to America, it's something where we have to be willing to call out when we think a decision's wrong. We've previously been willing to do that with respect to Iraq, with respect to Vietnam, and what matters is that it's an alliance, a relationship between two countries where we start as our own nation.
So the Labor Party would be happy to work with him possibly for another 4 years if this turns out to be undamaging, let's say, for his prospects of winning a second term.
Oh, the alliance between Australia and the United States continues regardless of who's in office there. Bob Hawke worked with Ronald Reagan. They weren't exactly political allies. You know, it goes a bit deeper than that.
Simon.
Look, I think one thing that's important to distinguish here is between were there criminal findings in the report and whether or not he'll face political consequences, particularly in the form of impeachment. So I don't think the questioner, you know, I don't think you should worry about him doing whatever he wants. He's still constrained by a Democrat Congress who a number of the leading contenders for president are in favour of impeaching him, despite the fact that the report found that he didn't seem to have done anything wrong. I think what's likely to come of this, and what I hope comes from this, is that people start to assess 2016 and the election through the prism of what actually happened, not through wishful thinking saying, oh, Trump stole this election, it wasn't real. You know, the Democrats have never accepted that their message and their candidate was rejected by a majority of the states in the union. That's a very important and big deal, and they've never dealt with that fact, and now they may have to.
Mueller seems to have found, of course, that the Russians did influence the outcome of the election. So I'm just wondering whether that changes the tone somewhat.
Oh, I think Russia has always tried to influence elections. China tries to influence
Yeah, but this time, according to Mueller, they did it.
Well, it's a question of how effective that was in terms of changing the votes compared to massive social and economic shifts within states in America. I mean, you know, the Clinton campaign was very poorly run. It didn't have a clear message. And the message that it was giving to those swing states was something they didn't want to hear. Trump laid waste to the Republican Party during that presidential run. He's now laying waste to the Democrats too.
Mehreen Faruqi.
Great question, Maya. Thanks for that. I mean, we've just seen a letter, practically, and yes, it exonerates him from collusion, but I would wait to see the full report.
And obstruction.
Actually,
he's not going to be charged for obstruction.
Yeah, but I would wait to see the full report to see what has actually come out of it. But it also says, if we look at the letter, it also says that there was intervention in spreading fake news, that there was intervention and hacking of Democratic Party emails. So we should be really concerned about that. But I think if we are concerned about what Trump means for the US, what Trump means for the world, then we should be concerned about his politics of racism. You know, he's called for a travel ban from people from Muslim countries. He is demonizing Mexican immigrants. He is a standard bearer for sexism. He's cutting back women's rights to choose. That's what we should be worried about. That's what we should be calling out every single day and helping our friends in the US to get rid of him at the next election.
Tony, I think I may be the only person here that's actually spent time with Trump.
Sorry, go ahead. You're saying you spent time with
I'm
Trump.
possibly the only person at the panel that spent time with Trump.
Is that on a golf course?
You don't need to spend time with Trump to know what he stands for, to be frank.
Sorry,
In 2006, I was a chaperone for Miss Australia for Australia's entrant in the Miss Universe contest when Trump was still running that. So he was there that whole time for a week, and I mean, I had a great deal of time talking to him about politics. He always said he intended to be you know, to run for president. He was none of those things. He was not racist, not sexist, none of those things.
Just because you didn't have an experience with him doesn't mean he hasn't done these terrible things. I mean, there's audio of him talking about grabbing a woman by the pussy.
I just made a joke about a cock earlier on.
Yes,
so I don't think there's much difference there.
A joke about a cock versus grabbing women and basically committing sexual assault are very different things. I'm body. I joke about sex constantly because it's awesome, but I'm not walking around thinking that I have a right to every woman's body simply because I feel an attraction to her. It's called self-control.
We should note for the audience, Teena, that your joke was off camera. You've now brought it into the public.
Oh, okay.
Let's move on, though. Our next question comes from Rabia Sharif.
I belong to the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, whose global motto is love for all and hatred for none. I repeat, love for all, hatred for none, which I believe are the words which should be embraced by all in this time and age. We are a community who also know very well that hate speech can result in innocent lives being taken, just as we have witnessed with the Christchurch attack. As a hijab-wearing Muslim, I am fearful of what's to come, especially when such hate has already come from certain leaders. To prevent any future targeted attacks, which arise through online hate speech and brainwashing, my question to the whole panel is, how free should free speech be in Australia, and how can we target and tackle the hate mongering? Where is the balance?
Mehreen, we'll start with you.
Rabia, I completely feel for you and your pain. Like, we are all shattered still from what happened in Christchurch. And, you know, we are still grieving for the friends and families of the targets of the horrific terrorist attack. But, you know, since the attack has happened, and even before the attack had happened, you know, Muslim Australians for years had been talking about this hate speech this vilification, this demonization of migrants and of Muslims that had started happening in Australia, but in the highest office of Australia. And we had been saying that this is damaging, this is hurting, and this will have consequences. But it wasn't just us saying it. It wasn't just me saying it. You know, our previous race discrimination commissioner has clearly said that, you know, what he has seen, what research suggested that hate speech and political violence are linked. In the aftermath of this attack, the New Zealand Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, wasn't shy of saying that, you know, hate speech leads to extremism. There are experts in the UK who have said that, you know, mainstream newspapers, when they spread this hate, they do actually feed to radicalisation of far-right extremists.
So, Mehreen, just to bring you to the point of the question, what restraints would you like to see on free speech in Australia, if any? Because often the way things are expressed are more subtle.
Well, I don't think that they have been very subtle. You know, Senator Fraser Anning, in his first speech, calling for a white Australia policy, calling for a ban on Muslim immigrants, that's not subtle. That is not subtle.
No, there's no question
Referring
about
to
that.
a final solution, that's not subtle. You know, calling for a certain community in Australia, and this is Minister Peter Dutton I'm referring to, that it was a mistake to let them in, that is not subtle. I think there is a clear difference between freedom of speech and hate speech. We do not have to blur the line. Like in a democracy, I would defend freedom of speech for the nth degree, but I will never, never say that hate speech is freedom of speech. But I think what's really important here as well is that, you know, our leaders are not learning. This is what has put me in a bit of despair after Christchurch, is that we have been saying this for years. We are still saying this. And, you know, neither Scott Morrison nor any of the Liberal National Government are actually listening. They're just dismissing it as if, you know, it doesn't mean anything. They have to admit that this has been happening. They have allowed it to happen. They have to reflect and they have to change.
Okay.
If not now, then when?
Let's hear from the Labor Party and Tony Burke. Does Labor have a clear idea of where you would draw the line on free speech in Australia?
Well, we've spent most of this term fighting the government, and last term fighting the government, where they wanted to allow more hate speech than what is currently permitted under the Race Discrimination Act. Tony Abbott tried to do it, and then, you know, Malcolm Turnbull, of all people, continued with it after the last election. Rabia, I'll go through my whole life in this country without ever experiencing that sort of hate speech. And if I get abused in a public place, it'll be for something that I've done, not for who I am. And I think there are two issues here. One is what forms of hate speech are unlawful, and the second is where do we also, with voices of power, and the media is one of them, exercise restraint. On where should it be unlawful, I certainly don't think we should weaken in any way the laws that we currently have, and I think we need to look really seriously about how they then make their way through on social media, really seriously on that. But there's also a level of restraint. I think the government should be as brutal in rejecting visas for people who come here to talk Islamophobia as we are for people who want to feed any other sort of terrorism. I really think we should be just as tough.
So
that also
do you have a kind of list of people that Labor would not allow into the country, or people who've come in that you think shouldn't have? The
classic example, and I'll say it on this program, I do not believe Milo Yiannopoulos should be given a platform in Australia. I do not. And we said that to the government. We wrote to the government asking them to reject the visa. The department recommended, the Department of Home Affairs of all departments, recommended he not be allowed in the country. The minister intervened to allow him, and it took Christchurch for them to reverse that decision. Now, we all have to take a step back. For those of us who don't experience hate speech, and I'm one of them, we need to have a moment where we put ourselves in someone else's shoes and understand this can be brutal. Not being able to just catch a train without receiving the threat of a level of abuse is brutal. And Australia should be the sort of multicultural nation where the first priority from the media, from the lawmakers, from all of us with a loud voice, is how do we focus on inclusion and bringing people together?
Simon.
Could I just very quickly add before
Very briefly,
you go to Simon, that, you know, we can actually make hate speech that incites violence illegal. We can do it through the criminal code. There is a lot of talk of making social media companies accountable, and we should. But we already have laws to do that, which we do not enforce. We know that.
We're going to come to the social media question in a little more detail in a moment. Simon.
Well, as far as I'm aware, inciting violence is actually illegal now. But we don't need new laws to make it illegal to incite violence. That is already illegal. And the difficulty that I have with the idea of the government banning hate speech is that it's not actually clear what constitutes hate speech and what constitutes discussion of difficult topics. And drawing the line at, is this offensive to someone, is, I think, a dangerous place to draw the line. The community should take an active role in rejecting racism, rejecting sexism, rejecting bigotry. That does not mean, however, that the government should be involved in doing all of these things. The bright line has to be, are you inciting violence? Are you doing something that will cause people to commit acts of violence or acts of terrorism? And I think we should absolutely reject that, and that is illegal at the moment. But once we start going beyond that, once we start trying to ban things like hate speech, once we start trying to impose subjective tests on whether or not something is hate speech, I think we're going down a dangerous path.
Roxane, does this debate remind you of what's been going on in the United States, or does the First Amendment actually make it kind of irrelevant because freedom of speech written into your constitution means even some very distasteful things can be said under protection of the constitution?
In many ways, the First Amendment does make it a moot conversation. But, you know, I think that it's really kind of disingenuous to suggest that talking about Islamophobia is matters of difference and differing opinions as if Islamophobia is a viewpoint that deserves time. It doesn't. It is something that we have to combat. And the challenge with freedom of speech is that people think it means freedom from consequence. And what we're really talking about is how do we implement consequences for people who use speech to radicalize hate. And we have to start doing that in material ways, because oftentimes what we do is rely on that slippery slope argument. And I'm a writer, so the freedom of speech is sacrosanct to me. And what I consider
Does that
my
mean
right...
the freedom to offend
yes.
people of whatever race?
Absolutely.
Or whatever religion?
You can do whatever you want with your freedom
creed.
of speech.
Yeah.
But I mean, I do judge you when you use your freedom of speech for stupidity and for hatred. I just think you have nothing better to do with your time. And so I do think...
Do you think it's a mark of more or less civilisation that racist comments can be made under the protection of the Constitution?
I think both. I think it's well and good that we protect this kind of speech, but I also think it's horrifying because so many things are excused in the name of the freedom of speech, and so many people are materially harmed in the name of the freedom of speech. And so we have to find ways to create material consequences for people. We have to say, sure, say whatever you want, but know that you're going to suffer these kinds of things. And deplatforming, I think, is one key way of doing that, removing these people from social networks, keeping Milo Yiannopoulos not only out of Australia, but frankly, every country. Send him to space and see what happens.
Teena.
The worst hate speech I've heard recently is Richard Di Natale. I mean, he comes out with absolutely disgraceful things. He's incited violence against the likes of Andrew Bolt. And Milo Yiannopoulos, I class him as an entertainer. Why everyone takes him seriously?
This is the problem we have, sorry. Let me just say, this is the problem that we have.
No one could possibly take Milo seriously.
Conservative commentators will not listen. For once, listen to what the Muslim community is saying.
Who would take Milo seriously? That's all I'm saying.
Hundreds of thousands of people in the United States take Milo seriously. They follow him. They pay money to go see him speak.
But I think they see him. People that I have spoken to who have paid to go and see him merely dismiss him as some sort of entertainer.
But once again, you're using your personal experience as a metric for reality. And can't just be, like, it's not that, it cannot be that subjective that I don't believe that Milo is this or that. I haven't experienced Trump as this or that, therefore I can apply it more broadly.
I can
Yes, you can.
Tina, I'm going to bring you up because you said something quite dramatic. You said that the leader of the Greens has incited violence against Andrew Bolt. So you better actually.
I heard an interview last Friday,
and what precisely
it was
are you
violent,
talking about?
But there were the attack on Andrew Bolt were from Greens. And the language that Richard Di Natale uses was just disgusting. And
what language was that? Could I ask, Teena?
In an interview with Andrew Bolt
but
on
what
Friday
language
night,
did he use?
The way he speaks about conservatives.
Mehreen, just hang on, please. Go ahead.
No, the vile language used against conservatives is disgraceful, absolutely disgraceful. But you watch the tape.
Can I just say? It's
said.
Probably defamatory to suggest that someone has incited violence against someone else without
I'm saying
proof.
that language, and that was what Andrew had said the other night, that the language that Richard and the Greens have incited, I mean, he has to have protection 24 hours a day.
So can we just be clear about this? It doesn't sound like he incited violence.
No, but I'm saying
it
was definitely hate speech that he used at the
This is the sort of fake news that you all spread. Really, frankly. And I've heard this many times after I said that there has been an atmosphere of Islamophobia, of anti-Muslim, of anti-immigrants created because of the open racism, because of the dog whistling, because of the race baiting.
Okay, Mehreen, I think you've made the point.
No, I do want to make the point that it is not morally, like racism and calling out racism, is not morally equivalent. It is nonsense to say that they are the same middle of the spectrum. They are two ends of a spectrum. You cannot compare, and it is silly and nonsensical to do that.
I'm just going to.
Racism is a thing that damages people.
Let's just see if the Labor Party is willing to defend
benefit, and anti-racism is actually calling it out and stopping that damage.
Mehreen, hold on. We're going to have to allow other people to speak. So, Tony Burke.
Yeah, I am going to defend Richard Di Natale in this, absolutely. Absolutely. And there is an argument coming at the moment that is trying to establish an equivalence between somebody saying we need to have a final solution, we need to ban Muslims from the country, from people who describe Islam as a disease, and because they say that angrily, think that the anger is the only thing that makes it hate speech. And therefore, if someone responds with some anger and a bit of passion, that somehow that's hate speech too. It's not. Yes, we will disagree on a whole range of issues. But to imply that somebody who is standing up against racism is guilty of the same sort of hate speech as the people who have allowed the hatred that we've seen in the last couple of weeks to fester and to have a base and be legitimised by so many people, it just doesn't add up. And please, like, you're in the same situation as me. Neither of us will ever experience this. But understand, a whole lot of Australians do. And they need people who aren't in the same situation to at least have a scintilla of empathy and say that we understand that being abused for who you are is different to just people disagreeing with you because of a view you hold. It's fundamentally different. That's why we are so strong as a nation and need to be strong against racism, against bigotry. And if the price is saying that's to stand up for Richard, I will.
You want a quick right of reply because you've got another question?
No.
OK, good. The next question is from...
standing up for Richard, that's enough.
The next question is Akos Ballard. Thank you.
Thank you. Even after Christchurch, many in the community are still concerned about Islamist terrorism. How is it possible to express those concerns without being accused of Islamophobia?
Simon Cowan.
Well, I think the easiest way is to deal with Islamic terrorism as it is. Condemn Islamic terrorism. Don't condemn Islam. The whole problem that we have here is that we want to say that because a particular group has a terrorist or a group of terrorists coming from them, that everyone in the group is somehow guilty of terrorism, that everyone who has a particular view is guilty of the worst crimes committed by someone within that group. I'm from Grafton, the town where the Christchurch killer came from. My community is shattered, not in the way that the Christchurch Islamic community is shattered, but in the way that we can't possibly understand how someone who came from our community could do something like that, right? But that doesn't mean that people who come from Grafton are terrible. The idea is you have to separate the actions of terrorists from the legitimate beliefs of people who support Islam. You have to separate the actions of white supremacist terrorists from people who want to have a legitimate debate about immigration, for example. I'm just going to quickly go back to our questioner. Arkos, you're a Presbyterian minister, I think, so a Christian minister. Is there a reason why you've asked that question? Do you feel constrained in some way?
Oh, it's not just for me. I think it's more a case of how do we have a civil discussion about issues that I think the gentleman there said were legitimate political issues. How do we have a legitimate political debate, staying respectful with each other, but dealing with issues that are, I would think, are legitimate points of debate.
Does your question imply that you feel you're not able to do that?
Oh, no, not personally, no.
One of the ways that you do that, though, is by condemning the sort of comments that Fraser Anning made. There's a difference between legitimate debate over immigration, and I'm actually in favour of a much bigger Australia, so I'm in favour of immigration. But condemning those fringe, unacceptable views as blatantly and completely unacceptable is the way that you have a legitimate discussion about policy. When you allow views like that to continue, when you allow them to have a mainstream platform, then you can't have a debate over these things. I think, you know, we need more internal policing of free speech and less external policing.
Yeah, before I come to you, Teena, how does that sound to you with your constitutional right to free speech?
Well, you know, I think that in many ways that question is kind of problematic because he didn't ask how can we talk about white male terrorism when it's a very real problem. And it is a very real problem because it was a white man who committed these murders in Christchurch, and yet we're still talking about how can we support Muslims while worrying about Islamic terrorism. Like, it has to go both ways. And so until we're like agreeing that this fundamental conversation needs to happen, there's no point in going any further. And in terms of freedom of speech, you know, again, it's important to protect freedom of speech, but it is not important to protect any nonsense that people want to say and deeply profound racism. Instead, we have to just try and figure out, why are you saying these things? Why are you believing these things? And oftentimes people don't have any good reasons. They have this empty ideology that was fomented in online spaces. And they also take just being disaffected and disillusioned, and that makes a really toxic brew of hatred. And until we address that, and until we start having more honest conversations about violence and where it comes from, I don't know that we're going to really make any sort of progress.
Teena McQueen.
I was just going to say Fraser Anning will be gone. I mean, even to say his name and give him any recognition, I think is just ridiculous. The guy is a nutter. No one wants to be associated with him, and thankfully he'll be out of Parliament after the next election.
Let's move on to our next question. It's from Anananya Bhattacharya.
Thanks, Tony. In Germany, big social media companies like Facebook and Twitter are required to remove content that qualifies as hate speech or face significant fines. Should Australia adopt a similar punitive approach to ensure that social media companies are held more accountable to remove extremist content?
I'll start with you, Tony Burke, because you mentioned social media, and you suggested, I think, in your earlier answer that Labor may have some thoughts on doing something about this.
We already have principles in the Race Discrimination Act about what you're allowed to say in Australia under Section 18C of the Act. There is nothing in the Act that says somehow social media are free, that they get a different set of laws. But we have not found a way yet to make sure that those are being enforced, and nor do I think there's been a whole lot of political focus on making sure that they're being focused on being dealt with online. If it's wrong to allow hate speech in the public square, it's wrong for it to be appearing on your phone. And how you deal with that is something that is pretty hard to do without the cooperation of the tech companies, but I think the tech companies know that change now needs to happen, and it does.
Yeah, but would a Labor government be prepared to force tech companies operating in Australia with online platforms that are global to do something about it? I mean, is there a way you can segregate your country from the information that's global?
And what I'm saying is, one, I'm not going to make any announcement tonight. Two, because they're global companies, it is difficult and is complex. But three, as a matter of Australian law, a lot of this is already unlawful, but is happening, and we need to work with the companies to find our way through that.
Simon, what do you think about this? Because, I mean, we know that your co-grafter night, if we can put it that way, went global in the sense that he joined on 8chan a group of people who thought like he did, and he was performing, in a sense, in the horrific sense, for them.
Absolutely, and I think Tony's point that it's difficult, I think it's all but impossible, in fact, to stop someone from posting something that is against the law, from doing something that is against the law in an online space when, you know, they're based in a different country, the platform's based in another country. I mean, who is even responsible for policing something like that? I mean, I think that the difficulty we have here is that these are new type of platforms. You know, it's the equivalent of someone going out into the street and screaming obscenities or screaming racial slurs. Who is actually responsible for policing that? Who is responsible for those statements? It's the person who makes them. You know, it's not the person who owns the square. It's not the council that's responsible for it. So it's very difficult to see, for me, how you can force a platform that basically just provides a space for people to say things, how you can enforce liability on them for providing that platform without removing those platforms altogether. All
right, I'll ask for our panellists to bear in mind what the last question was. I've got a Skype question, and while it's up and running, we'll go to it. It's on a similar subject from Latoya Rule in Adelaide.
Hi. So as a resident of Adelaide, I'm worried about the rise of neo-Nazism around our city. From swastikas, it's okay to be white posters with razor blades behind them, and graffiti which stated, no N-word, kill them. The terror of white supremacy and neo-Nazism is very much alive here, and I'm surprised that the recent attack carried out in Christchurch was not actually right out in my street. How can I be sure in knowing that we won't be the next site of an organised white supremacist terror attack, especially after Mark Latham's election?
Teena.
Look, I think this is reaching fever pitch. I mean, if things like that are happening in Adelaide, you call the police and you get these people dealt with and carted away. I mean, I've been to Adelaide many times, and I'm not doubting the question there, but if you see evidence of something like that, there's laws to protect people from that, and you get them carted off and deal with them.
Do you get that people like Latoya are afraid at this growth of right-wing extremism in their city?
She referred to Mark Latham, and I don't...
At the end of the question, yes.
Yeah, at the end of the question. You know, perhaps I'm in a bubble. I don't see the growth of white supremacists that I hear constantly. Well, you can laugh if you like, but I just don't. I know there's nutters everywhere on all sides, but I don't think thankfully, it's not an everyday occurrence in Australia.
I'm sorry.
Well, let Roxane go and then you can come in.
You are in a bubble, and that's really terrifying, because if you think that you can just call the police and they'll take away people who are racist, that's not how any of this works.
I understood she was being threatened. She was being threatened.
No, she said that she was seeing markers of hate speech. She said she was seeing posters in her community and more online chatter and in-person chatter from neo-Nazis, including signs that said, go away, N-word.
Yes, precisely. She said she was afraid because of these signs that she's seeing of the growth of right-wing extremism and then the murders in Christchurch. The same thing could happen in her city. So I guess as a politician, we're asking you, is that a serious concern?
I'm not a politician, Tony.
Well, OK, you're in the Liberal Party as the Vice President.
Yes.
OK, you're not strictly speaking a politician, but you're in politics. What do you think your party should do about it?
When we see evidence of anything like that, obviously we deal with it, you know, and it's the same as we ignore the types of Fraser Anning. We just don't give them any oxygen.
But here's the thing, you can't ignore it. Ignoring it is what contributes to these massive acts of violence. And, you know, as this, I forgot your name. Simon, yes. As Simon says, it's impossible. It's actually not impossible. When we have a town square, we don't allow littering. There are trash cans, because we have community standards that say we're not going to live in trash. And so people who curate online spaces can treat it in the exact same way. This kind of virulent racism is trash. And they can hire moderators to clean it up and determine we're a privately held company. We should have some kind of community standards about what we're going to allow to happen in our town square. And then as it extends into the offline space, you can enforce the laws that are supposedly on the books here in Australia in terms of racial discrimination and say that you cannot hang up these posters, you cannot intimidate, you cannot encourage neo-Nazism.
But that's what I just said.
No.
Yeah, I did. Exactly what I said.
OK, let's hear from Mehreen. Go ahead.
I'm afraid, Teena, you have not dealt with it. Your party has lined up and shook hands with Pauline Hanson after she did her hateful Islamophobic speech. Your party has stood up and shaken hands with
I'm not
Fraser
going to be
Anning
lectured to by Greens, let me tell you. I will not be lectured
yeah,
to
you will
by
not listen to
Greens.
the truth, I know that, but I will say it no matter. After the final solution speech, lined up to shake hands with Fraser Anning. Yes, you are in a bubble. And, you know, it's all well and good for you, Simon, and you, Teena, to have this academic argument about, you know, it's the person who said those things on the social media platform that should be responsible. It's not the carriage that should be responsible. You know, talk to the people who face death threats, abuse every single day, and I am one of those people. You know, on social media, people have said, put a bullet through her head. They have said, hold her still while I glass her. And those are just some of the comments. I can't even, I think, on television say what other threats, what other abuse I get. So this is actually real.
But you're not on your own there
real
with
people.
abuse. You are not on your own.
I know I'm not on your own.
We all cop abuse.
Yeah, this is, sorry, this is the problem that we have. So we have to do something about it. We have to act. And of course, one of the really strong actions is for our political leaders to stand up and condemn it every single time. You know, to call it out every single time, because that sets the tone for the debate. Because at the moment, what they've been doing is feeding the hatred. But we do have, social media companies have responsibility, as Tony said. Of course they have. So, you know, I had a quick look at the laws in Germany. But, you know, I know that there is some debate, and we need to look into them. This is a serious issue. But like I said earlier, we already have laws. The criminal code, which actually, you know, where carriages have to be responsible for menacing, harassing and offensive behaviour. But they're not. Whenever I have reported to the AFP, nothing has happened. Nothing has happened.
Now, Mehreen, I'm going to
Do not
interrupt
take
you
it
because we've got
seriously.
one last question on this subject and we need to go to it. It's from Caitlin Figueiredo.
Since the Christchurch terrorist attack, we have witnessed starkly contrasting leadership styles between Jacinda Ardern and Scott Morrison. Many Australians have commented online that they want to see a more compassionate and courageous leader like the New Zealand Prime Minister. Do you think there will be a swing against the standard masculine, power-driven politicians in the upcoming election?
Roxane, I'll start with you. Just make the broad point as a bad feminist, if you like.
Sure.
But you would have watched, much of the world has watched the way Jacinda Ardern handled this.
Absolutely. I thought she did a remarkable job. For once we saw a politician who didn't think about politics and thought about humanity and empathy and said the exact right things at the exact right time, and then did the right political thing by, within 6 days, banning semi-automatic weapons, which isn't going to eradicate this kind of violence, but is certainly a huge step in the right direction. I was incredibly impressed with what Jacinda Ardern did, and I really hope that more politicians around the world take a cue from her. And I don't think it's even about gender.
The Liberal Party did that years ago with John Howard.
Of course you did.
Yeah.
Do you, I mean, I guess one of the...
That's funny. John Howard did do that. Jacinda Ardern is copying exactly... Okay.
No, I mean...
Can I also remind you, Jacinda Ardern is only there because she formed an alliance with Winston Peters. I think everyone forgets that little fact.
What about the general point was, I think that Jacinda Ardern handled it in a certain way and that other politicians in Australia, including our leaders, handled it in a different way. Do you agree with that?
I think it happened in Jacinda's country. I mean, naturally, she's going to be closer to it and more connected to it. I mean, Scott Morrison was absolutely disgusted.
The person who did it came from this country, and that's part of the
Well, he spent
problem.
a number of years overseas, but I don't think the Prime Minister could have expressed his disgust any more than what he did. I mean, he was appalled by it. He's a very sensitive man. He was absolutely shaken by it, appalled by it. And I think he made that very clear.
Tony Burke.
I don't think anyone can understate how effective Jacinda was, Prime Minister Ardern, I should say, in providing the words that the whole world needed to hear. It was an extraordinary act of leadership, and I think to compare any of our politicians to that, they're all going to come up short. I think that's the reality. If there's a disappointment I have with the Prime Minister, it's not the words that he gave immediately following that. It's the fact that even after all of that, he's still contemplating preferencing one nation. Because...
That's not true, Tony Burke. That's simply not true. You don't know what he's doing. I'd have more idea than you, and that's not the case.
I'll just pause for one moment, because since we're on this topic, we might as well go to the question that we have on it. It's from Jack Jones.
Thanks, Tony. There has been a failure by Mr Morrison to call out One Nation and put their preference last, or put One Nation last, as both the Labor and Greens Party have done. Is Mr Morrison's reticence to do so putting politics over morality?
Now, Teena McQueen, you can respond to that first, because it's a question specifically related to, so far, the refusal of the Prime Minister to say that we will certainly be putting One Nation last. Now, you seem to indicate earlier that that's what the Liberal Party intended to do. Is that correct?
No, it's not the Prime Minister's decision. That's a decision by the federal executive, and we'll look at it on a seat-by-seat basis. I mean, clearly, there is no way myself personally would do any sort of real preference with the Greens after the vomit that comes out of their mouth. So, you know, you go on about One Nation, but you still don't listen to the absolute bile that comes out of De Natal, your leader. So we'll make no decision on that at the time when we look at candidates and different seats. I mean, clearly...
So you are contemplating preferencing One Nation?
No, we're contemplating
that sounds quite clear.
No, I'm not. I didn't say that at all, Tony. I said it depends on the seat and what candidates are standing, what parties are standing. We have no idea who we preference yet till we see who's available.
But you're absolutely not ruling it out.
Not ruling anything out. Though, I mean, Pauline Hanson has a large following. Look at the result of Mark Latham.
Of course, and you want that following to come to you, and that's what it's all about, isn't it? You have not listened to one single word that people have been saying for the last 10 years, or even the last 2 weeks, or even the last hour, have you? And that's the problem with the Liberal Party. And that's why they need to be turfed out come May.
Can I just ask one question? Has John Howard preferenced the Greens last? So I'm just saying One Nation, I beg your pardon, last. I'm just saying, would you, since you've mentioned John Howard in favourable terms on the gun laws just recently...
I'm saying that
Jacinda
Ardern copied John Howard.
Do you think the party should follow that line of preferencing the One Nation party last because of aspects of their policies which you could regard as racist?
There are aspects of the Greens policy that I regard as racist. So we have to look at all the candidates, as I said, until they come up.
What do you do? I give up. I give up.
All right. OK, Tony Burke, back to you. You started this.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tony.
If Jacinda Ardern can copy John Howard, in your words, why can't...
She took those policy on guns, and the audience seemed to think it was funny, but that's...
No.
Oddly, what
can I get through the sentence this time, please?
Sure.
If Jacinda Ardern can, in your words, copy John Howard, why can't Scott
Morrison...
Morrison...
Adopt his policies, yes.
Oh, wow.
If Jacinda Ardern can copy John Howard, why can't Scott Morrison copy John Howard and put One Nation last? From the primary vote that One Nation are on, it's not a case of, oh, they're no chance of getting elected, it's just trying to get these votes over the line. From the primary vote One Nation are on, if you preference them, you do it in the knowledge that you put them in Parliament. It's no good coming in here and claiming, oh, Fraser Anning, he'll be gone in a few minutes.
Well,
he's only in Parliament because he was on the One Nation ticket. If you're opposed to him, don't put more One Nation people in Parliament, and that means preference them last.
OK, now, I'm
not going to tell you how...
I'm going to give you a chance to respond to that, and no one can interrupt you, so go ahead.
I'm just saying we're not dictating to you how to preference, and, you know, we'll make our own decisions when the time comes.
OK, Simon, it sounds like we're not going to hear more on that subject, but I'll just ask you politically, do you think it would be a mistake for the government to give preferences in any seat to one nation?
Well, I think that's an interesting question, and I think what we need to... I mean, the Liberal Party can preference whoever they want. That's their decision. I'm not a member of the Liberal Party, so I have no say in that. But there is clearly a large group of disaffected voters in parts of Australia who are voting for people like One Nation. They're voting for the Liberal Democrats. You know, a huge portion of them put Clive Palmer into the Parliament in 2013. And I don't think we understand enough about who those people are and why it is they feel like the mainstream parties aren't listening to what they're saying. It's easy just to dismiss them and say, oh, they're just voting for One Nation because they're racist. I think there's actually a lot more to it than that. They're coming from communities that feel marginalised, that feel ignored by the major parties, and we've seen at every election for the last, 10 elections, the minor party vote on both the left and the right has grown. In spite of everything that the majors have done to try and bring it back, it's grown. Year after year, election after election. And I actually think we need to do a lot more to understand who those people are and what motivates their thinking.
I think it would be,
yes, briefly.
Because I haven't answered any of the last few questions. I think it would be wrong to blame voters, but it would be right because I think people are suffering. We're one of the richest countries in the world and so many of us are being left behind. But what these political parties are doing is actually using immigrants, using Muslims, or, you know, as scapegoats for the problems that people are facing, and that's the problem that we have.
Oh, that's ridiculous.
I just want to say a few things on Jacinda Ardern, if I could.
No, you're not going to do that. I think when we look at the word count, you'll do pretty well. Roxane, I just want to... This story we've actually heard a lot through the Trump era. So how does this argument sound to you?
You know, I think it's a convenient argument to excuse racism and to make people feel better about some of the underpinnings. I do think that there are people suffering in rural parts of both Australia and the United States, and they are people that are completely overlooked by political candidates of all swaths. Like, it's not just conservatives or liberals, it's people just don't look beyond the coasts of any country. And that's a real problem. But what politicians are doing is something that's incredibly damaging and cynical, which is that they are stoking anti-immigrant sentiments to get these people to blame something other than capitalism and economic realities that preference large cities over rural places. And until we educate people more effectively about what's really going on and why they're suffering, I think that they're going to continue to look for the easiest scapegoat. And they're going to continue to think that really, if we ban immigrants, our lives are somehow magically going to get better. And that's simply never going to ever happen. And racism is absolutely at the heart of a lot of it.
Can I just say, Tony, Mark Latham received a large vote in the Central Coast Hunter Valley areas. Now, I know why they voted for him. Mark is pro-coal mines, a lot of coal miners in those areas, generations of coal miners petrified of losing their jobs. So there's no racism, bigotry or anything. They simply voted for someone that is very pro-coal.
It's good to see you embrace a former Labor leader in such a way.
No, I'm not embracing.
No,
I'm stating why he
was,
received the vote.
That was a light-hearted
No, it wasn't light-hearted.
Let's turn now to the Labor Party.
A little bit touchy at the moment, Tony, so careful.
The next question comes from Susan Tracy.
Thank you, Tony. The Berejiklian government won its third term in New South Wales, winning seats in traditional Labor heartland. With 8 years in opposition, the Labor Party had all of that time to put a good case forward. Do you think it was Michael Daly's comments around Asians with PhDs and his slip-up in the debate that cost the election? Or do you think there's a deeper issue with the New South Wales brand and that it needs reinvention? And what does this mean federally?
Tony Burke.
OK, first of all, 130 days or whatever it was as a new leader it's hard to be able to make the case in that time. We have 4-year terms, and the best thing is to have a leader making the case for 4 years. When Bob Carr came to office, he'd been Leader of the Opposition for about 7 years. So we started in a situation where if we thought we could get close or over the line, it was considered extraordinary.
Did anyone know or have any clue that he'd made these racially divisive
No, and I'm not going to dodge that. I'll deal with them directly. Right. So that's where we were up until 7 days before the ballot. Then those statements emerged, that video emerged. It was offensive, it was unacceptable, he needed to apologise and he apologised. But from that moment, there was no momentum. What then happened in the debate continued to stall the momentum. And what we ended up with in the election, and congratulations to Gladys Berejiklian, I'm not dodging that, a win's a win. But we effectively, if you look seat by seat, had pretty much a status quo result. Not much shifted across the whole of New South Wales. It wasn't like what happened in Victoria. So I think there's a lot of lessons. There's a lesson very directly on what Roxane was saying about the difference between the city and the bush. The growth of minor parties in the bush and the disaffection there is huge. There is also, I think, a lesson that a whole lot of us had to learn. I had to learn it too, about stability and about the fact that one of the reasons people have preferred major parties historically is that we've said we provide stability. And both sides of politics have gone through phases at different points of not providing that. In New South Wales, when your leader's only there for 100 days, we didn't provide it. And federally now, that's why I think it's very important. We've had the same leader for 6 years, same shadow treasurer, same deputy. We've shown that we've learned our lessons.
Teena, go ahead.
I think it's a magnificent achievement for the Premier. I mean, 101 years, I think, since we got the vote to be Premier from a migrant background. I mean, this really shows how diverse the Liberal Party is, and she's magnificent. She'll be there for a long time. I think a huge win for women, and I don't see the women around celebrating this wonderful victory for Gladys. I really don't. As a matter of fact, there's been some dreadful comments from women on social media regarding Gladys. Just horrific.
Well, just because she's a woman doesn't mean she has acceptable politics.
She's not just a woman, she's a remarkable woman, and she's now the first elected Premier.
Teena, the question went to the implications for the federal election. We saw the Prime Minister on Saturday night. I said earlier, cock-a-hoop, which means very excited.
Yeah.
Not the way you took it. Not the way you imagined the term, but anyway,
well,
leave that aside.
Rosa didn't know either what it meant.
It's not an American expression.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, what did you think about the Prime Minister's response? Is he right that in a few months' time he'll be there, absolutely guaranteed, as Prime Minister?
Look, he's very enthusiastic, he's working hard, and clearly he's not going to have a defeatist approach. I mean, all politicians go in with the attitude to win the race, and I think Scott Morrison's no different. I mean, he was very excited. Honestly, a week out of that state election, we thought it was going to be very difficult for us to retain power, very hard. And there was great excitement in the room, and I think he was just expressing that excitement, and it just shows anything can happen in politics, and don't write us off yet.
Tony Burke, back to you on that. And one of the lessons, if I can just say this, from the New South Wales election, you mentioned yourself stability in the leadership, but also the economy. The New South Wales economy has been doing very well, but the federal economy, the Commonwealth economy is actually doing pretty well as well. Why would anyone want to take a risk to bring in another government? And if that is one of the lessons from New South Wales, are you worried about it?
I think the key metric on the economy is how does the economy affect you? And when person after person will say everything is going up except my wages, to get a report that national GDP has fallen in a positive way again doesn't really mean that much if your living standards have consistently gone down. And the measures of living standards have consistently gone down. That's what's happened. The only reason we are not in recession is because immigration has been covering it. GDP per capita has been going down. So the real lived experience of people across the country, I think every time the government boasts about how well everybody's doing, there's a bit of a reaction of, that's not what I'm seeing.
Simon?
Well, I'm not sure the evidence actually supports that claim, to be honest. There's been 3 periods where GDP per capita growth has fallen in the last 18 years, but by and large, wages have increased across the board from 1980 through to about 2015. We've seen living standards have largely gone up. Inequality has actually remained relatively flat. There's been a period of adjustment in the last few years, and terms of trade have fallen. Our interest rate is, reasonably low, but there is a period of structural uncertainty that we've been going through for a while at the moment, and it's affecting people in the economy. Not everyone is doing well, but the broad economic indicators are all positive. Whether or not that means that Scott Morrison will win another term, I think what's interesting is we've seen a decoupling of that link between strong economy and clear vote over the last few years. And I think people are voting a lot more on social policy issues like health and education than they are on economic factors like they might have done for Howard.
OK, remember, if you hear any doubtful claims on Q&A, let us know on Twitter. I'm not saying they were doubtful claims. Keep an eye on the RMIT ABC Fact Check and the Conversation website for the results. The next question comes via Skype. It's from Sonia Bayich in Henley Beach, South Australia.
Hi, my question is for Roxane Gay. In today's culture, we see many emasculated men. Is this a result and product of the feminazi movement on the rise?
Roxane.
That's absolutely not accurate. Men are not emasculated, and if they feel emasculated, that's about them. It has nothing to do with women. There's also no such thing as a feminazi. That is...
You've heard the term, obviously.
Oh, yeah, all the time.
What's
like, anytime...
What do you think the point of it is?
The point of it is to try and encourage women to not stand up for themselves and believe that they are equal to men, and that if you dare to believe you're equal to men, somehow, oh my God, you're so radical that you're almost as bad as a Nazi and an actual final solution. That's just not how any of this works. And I think it's really troubling that people think that A, men are being emasculated when men continue to thrive and basically continue to run the world, and that B, somehow women are responsible for the emasculation of men. I think instead we need to have more productive conversations about what can we do to elevate women and women's concerns and stop worrying about men, because they are, I promise you, going to be just fine.
I'm just going to see if... Is our Skype questioner still there? I don't know. Sonia,
yes, I am, yes.
So, I mean, have you seen any actual evidence of men in your orbit being emasculated? And I mean metaphorically.
Oh, absolutely. I feel it's from a cultural and linguistic diverse. There is issues out there, I guess. There are men who are struggling with their own gender identities, and I think there is a lot of pressure on them, and women as well, because we do want to live in an equal society. So,
yeah, is it worth the struggle?
Absolutely. I think we do need to carry on and work together and to create equal boundaries. We can't have this continuous argument in society where, you know, men are always going to be the leaders and women are the ones behind them. You know what I mean? There needs to be a huge gender balance and a power balance between both the sexes, in an ideal world, of course.
OK, Roxane, I'm sure you probably don't disagree with that at all.
No, I don't disagree with that. I do think that we need to see more of a balance of power throughout the world. And, you know, we're starting to see inklings of that. But quite frankly, in many countries, we're woefully behind the rest of the world that has had women leaders for decades. You know, in the United States, we still haven't had a woman president, and I don't know that we're going to have one in my lifetime, which is incredibly disheartening, but fingers crossed.
Well, the Liberal Party has a woman vice president, Teena.
Yes, and we have a female premier. We've had a female prime minister. I don't think women are doing so bad in Australia.
And what about the notion, the questioner said there, of men being emasculated? Do you see any evidence of that?
I see sometimes young men scared of women. I do see that women have become young women have become very empowered, and that's a great thing. But as you see the rise of power in the women, I do see some of the young men, yeah, it does threaten them a little.
Mehreen, what do you think?
We were just talking about the election of the first female Premier of New South Wales. It's 2019, folks. That tells you a lot about the state of politics and the state of patriarchy in New South Wales and basically the world. So, you know, I mean, I'll, you know, couch this all by saying that I'm very proudly a feminist AF. And I'm also, because I didn't get an opportunity to speak in the last question, I'm very proudly one of those Asian migrants with a PhD who's coming to take all your jobs.
So that racist remark by Daly is funny, But something
it's not funny at all. It is extremely racist.
Well, everyone's laughing
racist.
at exactly.
They were
No,
laughing at what I said,
joke.
not what they said. But I think we still, like, you know, surely we cannot deny the existence of such a huge gender gap in our society. We just cannot. It's a gender gap in pay. It's a gender gap in, you know, the number of parliamentarians who, you know, identify as women in our parliaments. There's so much more in that inequality that we need to deal with. But of course, we have to come together and respectfully talk about it and discuss it. But we are so far behind that, you know, starting to talk about the terms, you know, feminazi and all that, to me, that is not helpful at all. That is not helpful. We need to talk about reducing the gap.
Tony Burke, when you look around at your Labor colleagues, and the men in particular, do you see any metaphorically emasculated men worried about the nature of feminism?
No, look, after the next election, we'll be at 50-50. It's taken much longer than it should have to get there. And we did it with quotas, and a whole lot of people said, oh, that means women won't have same merit. But even the Liberal members of Parliament look across our front bench now, and there is no difference in the merit between the women and the men. If anything, you know, some of the women like Teena Plibersek or Penny Wong absolutely stand out as the most valuable people Labor has. So the only other thing I'd just add to that, in terms of the earlier economic discussion, there would be nothing greater that would be a boost to the economy of Australia than to have equal pay in this country. Nothing greater. And I think we often do the social policy bit and then we do the economic policy bit and we pretend that it's all different.
So is that an election promise that we're hearing here, that Labor will promise to, like, land a man on the moon in 10 years, to have equal pay between men and women in this country? Is that going to be a sort of... Or is it just something that you said rhetorically?
No, I can tell you we will have a lot to say about equal pay in this election. The announcements won't be made by the environment spokesperson, but we will have a lot to say.
So, but that is a forecast, is it?
I've given you more than I should have, Tony. Be happy.
Tell us more, Tony. Tell us more.
Simon.
Look, I think there are some problems for young men in our society, but I don't think it's been caused by feminism. I don't think it's been caused by women either. I think, you know, young men in particular have a problem with suicide. There's a number of young men who struggle at school. You know, if you look at the gender breakdown of people going to university, it's a significant majority is now women. There are problems for young men, particularly in remote and rural communities, where they feel like they don't have any options, and a lot of them commit suicide. It's unfortunate. But I don't think that's caused by feminism. I don't think that's caused by women. And I think putting it in those terms, saying that it has to be...
What do you think it's caused by, Simon? I'm just... it is a huge problem. I mean, we've just come from Townsville and it's... You know when you go into regional Australia that this is a particularly bad problem in regional Australia.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, part of it's economic. There's opportunities that have gone from those communities and nothing has replaced them. Part of it's social too. There's been an enormous dislocation from regional communities that used to be very close-knit. They used to have a lot of, you know, there'd be a lot of people in the Rotary Club, the Country Women's Association. There'd be all of these community groups and activities that would bind people together, and a lot of that's fallen away. And I think a lot of young men are struggling to understand where their place is in society and their place is in the world. And I think, you know, some people have given them scapegoats. You know, that's what white supremacy is, one of those scapegoats. We've seen other scapegoats through feminism and women, and you know, the list goes on and on. Immigrants, but I think, you know, there's a genuine problem of dislocation that we need to understand better, and it's not helped by blaming the scapegoats.
Roxane, I'm going to give you the final word because we're just about out of time, but you've got a global perspective on this, and I'm just wondering, when you think about the role of women in society, do you also think about the role of men and the sort of things that I guess Trump has been talking about, the disenfranchised people that voted for him, but also what Simon is saying?
You know, I think what Simon is saying is incredibly valid, and I do think that there are a lot of disaffected young men in the world, especially in Australia and in the United States, who don't know where they belong. But I also think that we place a disproportionate amount of attention on these disaffected young men while women are still struggling in so many ways. I think we can do both. I think that we have enough cultural attention to address disaffected men and disempowered women. And as a feminist, I know that men are going to be fine because we have so many people who are constantly worrying about them and writing entire books.
The suicide rate indicates that men are killing themselves.
Yes, and so are women, and so are transgender people. Lots of people are killing themselves because the world is a terrible place right now. And we can care about all of it. There's actually room to extend our empathy to care about it all. What I'm saying is that we don't need to prioritize men over women. We can, for once in history, prioritize women, and men are still going to be taken care of and are still going to have legions of people who are concerned with their emotional and mental health.
Well, that's where we have to leave it. It's all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel, Teena McQueen, Roxane Gay, Mehreen Faruqi, Tony Burke and Simon Cowan. Thank you very much. Now, you can continue the discussion with Q&A Extra on News Radio and Facebook Live, where Tracy Holmes is joined by David McKnight from the University of New South Wales. And next week on Q&A, we're 1 week closer to the general election. On the panel, former Liberal frontbencher and long-time party strategist Arthur Sinodinos. Labor frontbencher Amanda Rishworth, social analyst Rebecca Huntley, whose latest essay calls for politicians to listen to the popular mood for a change. The Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs, John Roscombe, and one other to be announced. Until next week, good night.